So we've been looking at dimensions, and I equated them to, or rather I used it to view duality. Duality in that narrative, rather an aspect. So we used the example of good and evil. So good and evil will be the aspect, and the aspect itself will be divided into two, where in one side it's good and the other side it's bad. So, and also this we involved other aspects. So here we have good and evil. So there will also be positivity and negativity. There will be up and down. There will be left and right, and so on. So that was how we were looking at duality. And what I stated is the entire aspect could be three-dimensional in that it's a sphere. But since we are of a lower dimension to it, we'll only experience a segment of it. So be it good and or bad. So you can either be getting good, bad, or both. And so then we look at what the distinction. We divided it into 4 quarters. So quarters, we divided it into 4. So this the half, where you either experience one side or the other, or you experience both halves, but as distinct halves. And being we used a sphere, these halves might not be exactly accurate halves, but we'll be holding two sides to it. So yeah. Okay, so the essence of this, rather, we deduce that at the end, then it's actually a fixed aspect, and this fixed aspect, we will experience it fractionally, and this is because of the dimensions. So yeah, now we're looking at dimensions, and we're looking at it in terms of the numbers. So we were previously, we'd look at how 1, 0, and infinity could relate. And now we have 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, 4 dimensions. I'd rather we limit, well, it's my preference. I prefer that we limit it to, let's say, 7 dimensions. But I'll focus on the second, third, and fourth. That's my preference. So the dimensions and the numbers. We were looking at the dimensions, so no dimensions, so there's essentially nothing. And in that aspect, there's no time and there's no space. So where does existence fitting? So existence will just exist even if there is no space or time, because in that situation there's only absence, or rather nothing. And so it itself is part of an aspect. So there's everything and there's nothing. There's something and there's nothing. So it's part of an aspect. So meaning there's the other half of it where it is existence. So even in an existence, well, we say, so let's look at there is non-existence and there is existence. So there's in one half there is non-existence, and non-existence will exist in non-existence. So non-existence exists because it's non-existent, and that's the zero. No dimensions, no anything. It's basically nothing. So that's zero. But then it's from nothingness being something that we get the one. And so from no dimensions, we get one dimension. So let's use my fingers. So as it is, there is nothing between these two spaces. We assume so. There's nothing between my fingers. So no dimensions. But then we go this. So there's a space between my fingers now, and this space can be occupied. And what occupies that space, we haven't reduced it yet, but this space can be occupied. So moving from no space to space, this caused a change to happen. And this is where time comes in, because time is the rate of change. So in zero dimensions, there was no space and there was no time. But then there was the first dimension. And in the first dimension, we see there was space. So yes, there's space, but then from that space, we get change, a rate of change. And so we find time. And with the coming of time, then that's another dimension. That's another dimension. Because we're looking at the space, this particular space, but then there was the moment here to here. So that period is another dimension. The same way we're looking at our three-dimensional world. It's four-dimensional because at this particular moment, right now, and then now. So those are two different scenes. So that's time. At one point, there wasn't something, and then at another point, there was something. The rate of change. So that's a way we can look at our existence. And so here we've moved from having no dimensions, and we've looked at the upcoming of two dimensions. So this is, we moved from 0D, we've gone to 1D, then 2D. So how we were describing 1D, it was a single point. So this particular space, that's the sphere. This is where everything will exist in. So in this particular space, that's where everything will exist in. And this particular space is enlarging and enlarging. So mind you, above my fingers, rather above the space, there was also nothing. And there continues to be nothing, rather at least in how we're going forward with the entire discussion. So there was nothing and there continues to be nothing. So there's space to occupy. So here we find within our fingers there is space, but then above our fingers there is also space. But this particular space above our fingers we cannot access, just because of the limitations of physics and everything. But there is space because the universe is constantly expanding, and the space in which it's expanding to had to exist in order for it to expand into it. It's the same way in the beginning. There had to be a canvas for God to paint on. So, yeah, that space exists, and if it doesn't exist, it will exist before the universe gets to occupy it. So it has to exist so that the universe can occupy it. So that's a third dimension. Non-existence becoming existence. So how exactly? We started from space being, let's say it's the first dimension. The rate of change also brought about the second dimension, which is time, and expansion now brings us to the third dimension. What the fourth could be, well, I can say for sure, but these dimensions themselves, I'm just using them as placeholders because so I can bring out a point. But yeah, so far, yeah. Now, the dimensions in relation to the dimension numbers in relation to dimensions in relation to the numbers. So these dimensions, they are infinitely thin. But in order to create a higher dimension, multiple of them have to be there. So from non-existence, multiple non-existence have to come together to bring about existence. I can't explain, rather I don't know how that could come by, but maybe we'll get there, maybe. But so, okay, now let's go to the first dimension. So now we have a point. So this point is infinitely small. But then, since there's nothing else, it's infinitely large. Still, we can compile multiple of these points. So, multiple of these points make a single line. And this line right now is finite. But because it's within non-existence, then it's essentially infinitely long. So, either way. So, we have a finite line which is infinitely long. So, we combine these lines and now we have a shape. So, let's say a square or circle, either way. In order to compile these lines, just at the same way we had to compile the points, we had to move up another dimension. So yeah, now we have a shape. And in order to move to the other dimension, we have to compile these shapes again. So the means of compiling. So we started from a single point, which we compiled them to form a line. And how these two relate in order to join, to fuse, to become a line, they had to fuse multiple of them. And how these fuse, well, I can't say for sure, because each individual point is infinitely large, just it's infinitely small. So the space for them to combine, or rather the points of contact, they are always approaching, but they never really get there. So it's like they interact, right? They relate to each other, but they don't really come into contact. So each individual point is unique, but then this unique point, they come together in order to make another unique thing, which is the line. But then how do they fuse? Well, we look at atoms. They have their respective forces. And these forces, to us, they're quite tiny, but to them, they're extremely strong. Because assuming an atom from its nucleus, if we were to scale the size of an the nucleus to be the size of, let's say, golf ball, and assuming this is a hydrogen atom, where the electron will be quite a distance. I'm assuming, let's say, a kilometer away. Yeah, I guess, I don't know. So, a golf ball attracting an electron, which is essentially a kilometer away. And the size of this electron will be probably the size of a marble or smaller. So, yeah, they have quite the force between them. So, here we're looking at atoms, and to us, atoms are quite small. But then, to the atom itself, this particular point we're talking of, which has compiled in order to make the atom itself, is even more smaller, much more smaller. Assume the Planck length. So yeah, that itself is way much smaller. So yeah. So we put the example of this particular force. The combining of these 2 points, these two these infinite points, the combining of these 2 points, it's so infinitely small, the gap between them, that essentially we assume that they become one. Yeah, we essentially assume they become one. But they're still unique. But either way, they end up making up the entire universe. So, how can we place, rather, how can we end the discussion here? Well, essentially, no, I don't have.